Ripples of Faith. Chapter 1. The Loss. 2 a.m. Adam jolted awake for the second time that night, his body damp with sweat and his throat parched. The sorrow settled deep in his chest. 3 days had passed since his mother's death, but each time he opened his eyes he forgot, until the silence around him destroyed the illusion. Tears flowed uncontrollably and unexpectedly. She was the only person he had ever felt close to. Adam leaned back against his pillow, struggling to come to terms with the unfamiliar reality that now defined his life. She was only 48, too young to be taken. Why God? He turned the question over and over in his mind, unable to accept the unfairness. Sleep had abandoned him, leaving him to trace the dark contours of his room, as if the shadows might somehow share his pain. Hours passed in restless silence, and by the time dawn crept in through the curtains, its pale light felt like an unwelcome guest. It revealed the truth the night had hidden, his profound, unbearable solitude. Today is her funeral, a day he had never imagined facing. The disease had stolen her away so quickly. There was still so much he wanted to tell her, and countless questions he wished he had found the courage to ask while he still had the chance. But life, in its cruel irony, had given him the means to repay her sacrifices only after it had taken her away. Now, she was gone. With an effort that felt monumental, Adam pushed himself out of bed. Exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, the grief making every movement heavy and slow. He paused, staring blankly at the floor, as if trying to summon the strength he needed to move forward. Finally, he took a deep breath and forced himself to shuffle across the room. As he dressed, the memories began to flood back, vivid and persistent. He could almost hear her voice from the kitchen, warm and full of life. The scent of coffee and scrambled eggs seemed to hang in the air, carried by the ghost of her presence. "You should eat well, Adam," she would say, setting a plate down with her usual precision. "Breakfast is important to start your day right." Her love had always been in the details, her unwavering concern for his health, his future, his happiness. She had given everything to ensure he could stand on his own 2 feet, even as life had tested her at every turn. "This degree you're working for, it will change everything," she used to remind him, her voice steady and reassuring. "Don't worry about anything. As long as I'm alive, you'll never lack for anything." The memory twisted like a knife in his chest. Those words, once so comforting, now rang hollow. She hadn't prepared him for this. She couldn't have imagined leaving him so soon. For the first time, he felt betrayed, not just by her absence, but by the universe, by God. He shook his head and glanced at the clock. The day wasn't going to wait for him. It would be a tiny funeral. They had no family or close friends to gather with. A handful of colleagues, people he'd only met in the 6 months since he started at the company, had offered to come. Most of them knew little about him, but when they heard of his mother's death, they reached out with kindness. He had agreed, grateful for their support, but suddenly an uneasy thought tugged at him. "They'll notice that I have no one," he realized, feeling a vulnerability he couldn't quite describe. Then, almost enraged, he caught himself. "How foolish am I? I've lost the most important person in my life, and here I am, worrying about what others think." Standing by the church entrance, he stared at the empty pews and imagined her gentle, reassuring smile. In the big wooden coffin at the front, she lay motionless, her face serene yet strangely lifeless. The subtle scent of lilies filled the air, a reminder of the fragility of life. She would be buried in a cemetery with no family waiting to greet her. For the first time, it struck him how little he knew of his family's history. "Why don't I have any relatives?" he wondered. "Why have I never thought to ask?" But his mother had been his entire world. With her, he had never felt the need to look beyond their life together. She had made his world feel whole. Now, with that foundation gone, questions began to gnaw at him, each sharper than the last. As he braced himself for the day ahead, the shadow of loss enveloped him, refusing to loosen its grip. In the calmness of the church, Adam gripped the thought. At least she would at peace. This place, with its solemn stillness and echoes of devotion, had always been her sanctuary, her bridge to something beyond the pain of this life. She had never wavered or doubted her faith in the face of adversity. Heaven, the conflict between good and evil, and the promise of justice had carried her through her existence. Her life had been spent hoping for justice to prevail, until the day she died. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. With the few people who had come to support him, Adam laid his mother to rest. As the casket began to lower, he felt something inside him break, a sharp, intolerable pain as though the ground beneath him had crumbled away. Every sound, every whisper, magnified the enormity of what he had lost, echoing in the vast void left within him. His knees buckled and he collapsed, overwhelmed by the weight of his grief. The world around him blurred, the strength to hold himself together slipping away entirely. Sam, his colleague, was instantly by his side, kneeling next to him, his voice calm yet steady. "Adam, take your time," Sam murmured, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to bottle it all up." Adam glanced at him, his vision clouded by tears. Sam didn't speak further, nor did he rush him. He simply stayed, his quiet presence anchoring Adam in the moment. Nearby, a few co-workers stood in sad quiet, unable to hold back their tears as they witnessed Adam's raw and unvarnished grief. Suddenly Adam stood, wiping his eyes and steadying himself. His chest clenched, but he forced himself to straighten, certain she was watching. He couldn't let her see him this way. With a deep, trembling breath, he nodded toward the burial workers, signaling them to continue. Once Adam had steadied himself, a flood of burning questions rose within him, demanding answers. Why, God? Why her? Why now? In a moment of despair, his mother had always urged him to turn to God. But how could he? This wasn't just another hardship, it was an irreparable loss, and the very one he was supposed to turn to was the one who had caused it. How could he make a complaint to a judge who was also the guilty party? The paradox left Adam enraged and perplexed, with no explanation, no matter how divine, able to make sense of it. As the ceremony concluded, those who had come to pay their respects expressed muted condolences before departing. The cemetery soon became deserted, except for Adam and the trees, their branches swaying smoothly in the whispering wind. The emptiness was suffocating. He couldn't bring himself to leave her there, surrounded by cold ground and shadows. How would she manage the darkness, the loneliness? For a moment, the thought of following her seemed like the only escape from his crushing despair. But deep down, Adam knew he couldn't. She was gone, and he had to stay. With a trembling voice, he murmured final goodbyes. Then, with his feet dragging as if burdened down by the mass of the world, he turned and walked away. Each step felt like a betrayal, as if leaving her behind meant forgetting,